118,000 original recordings, gone in a single night. How does a disaster of that scale stay buried for over a decade? And if the official number was a lie, what else was hidden? On June 1, 2008, a fire broke out on the roof of a building at Universal Studios Hollywood, and the public was told it was a minor incident. The official story claimed only a handful of master recordings were lost, and the event quickly faded from the news cycle. But what if the scale of that disaster was hidden from the world for over a decade? The truth, as reported by the New York Times in 2019, reveals that the fire completely destroyed 118,000 film reels and audio tapes, an estimated 500,000 master recordings. Did the company deliberately mislead the public about one of the greatest cultural losses in modern history? The fire itself started from a welder's torch on the roof of a building housing the tape vault, and the flames, fueled by insulation and wooden structures, quickly consumed far more than the initially contained area. In the immediate aftermath, Universal Music Group announced that only about 17,000 recordings had been destroyed. However, an internal investigation report, later unearthed by The Verge, showed that their own records confirmed the actual number was 118,000 lost masters, a figure nearly 7 times higher than the official estimate. The scale becomes even more staggering when you realise this vault was a catastrophic graveyard for icons like Chuck Berry, Nirvana and Eminem, representing almost 700 different artists whose life's work was turned to ash. Among the hundreds of victims were legendary artists like Aretha Franklin and contemporary superstars like Lady Gaga, and yet, most of them had no idea their recordings were even at risk. It was only when the New York Times published its investigation 11 years later, in 2019, that a wave of shock rippled through the music industry as artists discovered their work had been destroyed without ever receiving a notification. Walter Becker, guitarist for the rock band Steely Dan, was one of those artists, and he told Rolling Stone that losing the master tapes for albums like Aha and Gaucho was like losing a part of their youth, irreplaceable. The company had hidden this from their own talent for over a decade. So if the official numbers were off by such a huge margin, what exactly caused the blaze to spread with such devastating speed? The fire that tore through the Universal Studios lot in 2008 didn't just destroy a building, it revealed a horrifying truth about a material we once trusted with our most precious art. Magnetic tape, the very medium that held the master recordings of generations, is chemically engineered for its own destruction. The binder holding the iron oxide particles to the plastifilm was often made with nitrocellulose, a highly flammable compound that essentially acts as fuel once ignited, and at temperatures around 200 degrees Celsius, the magnet permanently warped, as detailed by the Audio Engineering Society. This isn't a scenario where you can just wipe off some soot. The very physical structure that encodes the sound is compromised at a molecular level. Forensic analysis from the Universal fire itself painted an even more desperate picture. The master tapes were typically stored on metal shelves, but as the heat climbed past 150 degrees Celsius, the plastic reels didn't just burn. They melted and fused together into a solid, irredeemable mass. According to the New York Times in 2019, this meant that even if a tape wasn't completely consumed by flames, it was still unsalvageable, its layers welded into a single useless block of plastic. The sheer speed of this destruction was foreseen long before, as a 1967 fire at the RCA facility in Nashville was contained within 2 hours, but still managed to annihilate an entire room of tapes, showing how quickly flames travel through a vault packed with thousands of flammable reels. But the most insidious killer wasn't always the direct contact with fire. The smoke itself was a corrosive agent. When the plastic casings, particularly those containing polyvinyl chloride, began to burn, they released hydrochloric acid within the first 10 minutes. As documented by the National Fire Protection Association in 2019, this acidic smoke would eat away at the metal coating on the tapes even if the fire was in a different part of the archive, silently ruining data that never touched a single flame. So, if you ever face small fire, the Smithsonian Institution has a specific rescue protocol, but it's a race against a clock measured in hours, not days. First, you must put on gloves and immediately seal any surviving reels in airtight vacuum bags to prevent further acid damage. Next, you cool them gradually in a refrigerator for 48 hours to stop the magnetic layer from cracking due to sudden contraction. Then, you can identify which tapes are still in their original reel shape, as these have a minimal chance of being cleaned, using an ultrasonic machine to remove soot. Finally, you test a 10-second segment. If any sound is audible, you have just 24 hours to get it to a professional for emergency digitization. Because after any fire exposure, the tape oxidizes 10 times faster than normal. The truth is that a fire doesn't just burn our history, it creates the very conditions that guarantee we can't save what's left. Long before the digital age taught us to fear a corrupted hard drive, a fire in a Nashville warehouse in 1967 silently erased a cornerstone of American music. The Recording Corporation of America, known as RCA, lost over 500 master tapes belonging to the titans of the era, with artists like Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash finding their original recordings reduced to ash. It took firefighters roughly 2 hours to bring the blaze under control. Yet that brief window was enough to consume an entire room filled with irreplaceable plastic and magnetic oxide. Can you imagine the sheer speed of a fire so hungry that it devoured the legacy of legends before the engines even arrived? The loss was staggering, but the story of that day holds a strangely specific detail that makes the tragedy even more human. A trained arson dog named Smokey was on the scene, a dog specifically taught to sniff out hidden electrical sparks smouldering inside the walls. Despite his keen nose and the best efforts of the crew, the flames found a path through the ventilation shafts, rendering the primitive firefighting methods of the 60s completely useless. It's a haunting image, a hero dog, unable to stop the inevitable, standing in the smoke while history melts around him. Among the voices lost in that inferno was one particularly poignant casualty, a young Dolly Parton who was years away from becoming a global superstar. She later confirmed that the very first recordings of songs she would carry with her for decades were destroyed, feeling as though a part of her heart had been thrown into the flames. Yet the cruel twist of fate is that a few safety copies survived, tucked away not in a vault but in the personal suitcase of a sound engineer. That single, almost accidental act of portability was the only reason those early songs still exist at all, a fragile thread between memory and oblivion. When you trust a company with your most irreplaceable records, you assume they have thought of everything. But in 2019, a fire tore through an Iron Mountain data storage facility in New Jersey, and the world learned a terrifying lesson about where our history actually lives. The facility was supposed to be a fortress, yet the flames consumed data belonging to countless clients, erasing documents and media that were never backed up anywhere else. How can a multi-billion-dollar industry built on safeguarding our collective memory be so fragile? The real damage went far beyond lost music or old paperwork, reaching into the very heart of the legal system. Law firms and government agencies suddenly discovered they had no digital copies for thousands of paper files, destroying legal evidence for numerous active cases. It was a consequence almost no one considers when imagining a burning warehouse, yet it unraveled years of ongoing litigation in an instant. This wasn't just a cultural tragedy, it crippled the machinery of justice, leaving lawyers and their clients with nothing but the ashes of their proof. How could the pillars of our legal system remain so dangerously unprepared for a threat we know exists? This incident forces a deeper question about the entire model of centralized, professional storage, because it clearly wasn't an isolated freak accident. Consider the FBI statistics, which reveal that fires of unknown origin in private storage facilities occur at a rate 2.5 times higher than in ordinary residential buildings. Those numbers stand in stark contrast to the safety measures these companies advertise so confidently to their customers. It suggests that the risk isn't just a possibility, it's an inherent flaw in a system designed to be secure. Why do we keep paying for the illusion of protection when the numbers openly contradict it? In February 2020, a fire broke out at a small factory in California, and the entire global vinyl record industry suddenly froze. The building belonged to Apollo Masters, the only manufacturer on Earth producing the lacquer discs needed to cut every vinyl master. A single blaze at one specialized facility threatened the production chain for every record plant worldwide, proof of how fragile the industry truly is. The company had spent decades perfecting a secret recipe for those lacquer blanks, and no competitor had ever come close to replicating it. When smoke rose from that facility in Banning, pressing plants from Nashville to Tokyo realized they had nowhere else to turn. The irony cuts deep. The Recording Industry Association of America reported that vinyl revenue had climbed from $89 million in 2010 to $619 million by 2020, sparking a remastering boom that made original tapes more valuable than ever. Yet the entire revival rested on the output of one unassuming workshop that a carelessly tossed cigarette could have taken down. Even the masters themselves became prized financial assets in this renewed market. In 2015, a single 24-track master tape from a famous album sold at auction for $1 million, revealing that these reels were not just cultural treasures but serious investments. So when Apollo burned, the message was unmistakable. The music world had built its most profitable comeback on the most fragile foundation imaginable. The question no one wanted to ask was simple. If one small fire could halt the entire vinyl industry, what would happen to the original recordings that kept the whole system alive? In 2010, a fire at a Philips storage facility in Amsterdam destroyed 90,000 master tapes of classical recordings. This massive loss of European musical heritage barely registered with the public because it didn't involve American rock legends. The silence around this cultural erasure is deafening when you realize what was lost. But contrast that with what happened at Disney in 1974 when fire hit their Burbank vaults. Did they lose everything that day? No, and the difference between these two tragedies teaches us everything about preservation. The Disney fire did destroy original film elements, but animators discovered that answer prints were still safe in their cutting rooms. This lucky find saved a crucial portion of their work. Disney had a second storage facility just a few miles away, which explains why the damage was contained. That single decision to distribute their archive probably preserved some of the most beloved animations in history. Can you imagine the heartbreak of the Dutch archivists watching their entire legacy reduced to ash? The Philips case remains a shadow in music history, but not because the loss was unimportant. The recordings simply didn't belong to the dominant narrative of rock and roll, so the world shrugged. However, the real lesson here isn't about fame or cultural bias. It is about the safety net that Disney inadvertently built. They scattered their treasures, so a single disaster couldn't wipe them out. The Dutch archive kept everything in one place, and that made it a target for total annihilation. Do you have your own irreplaceable recordings sitting in a single cardboard box? If a fire or a flood hit your home today, would your personal history survive? The difference between complete loss and a salvageable story often comes down to something as simple as having a second location. For your own archive, experts from NFPA and CAL FIRE recommend practical steps to create that safety buffer. Never store tapes near heat sources like fireplaces or hot water pipes, and keep the room temperature stable between 18 and 20 degrees Celsius with humidity at 40%. Check your wiring and avoid overloading outlets since electrical shorts cause most fires. Metal cabinets with sealed doors beat plastic ones, and maintain at least 50 centimeters between shelves for firefighter access. Install remote temperature monitoring over Wi-Fi so you get an alert the moment conditions spike, and pair it with an automatic dehumidifier. These precautions may feel excessive, but they are cheap compared to losing a lifetime of memories. The Dutch institution had none of these safeguards, and Disney had only a fraction of them. Yet the latter's partial redundancy made all the difference. So the next time you consider your family photos or your demo tapes, ask yourself one question. Could your culture survive a single spark? Because if your answer is no, then you are holding a disaster waiting to happen. In 2022, a team of audio engineers at the University of South Carolina unveiled a technique that sounds like science fiction. They developed a 3D laser scanner capable of reading magnetic tape that has been warped and damaged by extreme heat, all without ever opening the reel. But here is the catch that tempers the miracle. This solution only works on tape that has not been completely incinerated, leaving severely burned archives beyond its reach. For the tapes that survive, archivists lean on a different kind of defense, one that avoids the most destructive element of all. They use gas suppression systems like FM200 or argonite instead of water, because water instantly destroys the magnetic oxide layer on the tape, erasing data beyond any hope of recovery. According to the Library of Congress, this choice is not about preference but about physics, as a single burst from a sprinkler can finish what the fire started. Even the architecture of storage is evolving to buy precious minutes in an emergency. The California Fire Agency, CAL FIRE, reports that private archives are now turning to anechoic vaults, rooms designed to dampen both sound and heat transfer, which can slow the spread of a fire by 60% compared to open shelving. Imagine a vault so specialized that it treats temperature like an acoustic wave, muffling the inferno itself. Yet for all this innovation, the practical reality of preservation remains a wall of cost that most cannot climb. Digitizing a single hour of analog tape runs about $300, a figure cited by the Library of Congress, and the major labels hold hundreds of thousands of hours. That math creates a stubborn paradox. The very technology that could save our musical history is priced exactly where the people who own that history cannot afford it. Sometimes the story takes a different turn, proving that loss can forge something unexpected. In 2016, the indie artist Colleen Green lost the entire recording of her third album when a small fire swept through her Los Angeles studio. She spent the next 6 months rebuilding it from scratch, but she told LA Weekly that the new version was better because she was older and played better. The fire could not undo her voice, and what she remade carried a maturity the original never had. These tools and systems offer a fragile hope, a thin thread of possibility weaving through the ashes. The laser might read a damaged reel, the gas might shield a shelf from water, and the vault might slow a blaze, but each triumph comes with a limitation. The only true safeguard lies in one tedious, expensive act, moving the music off the tape before the tape meets its end. In the end, the question is not whether we can preserve these recordings, but whether we are willing to pay for the time to do it. You might assume that a corporation holding billions in cultural assets would insure them. The reality, confirmed by reports from Variety in 2019, is that Universal Music Group had no specific insurance policy for its master tapes at all. These recordings were classified as intangible assets, deemed too difficult to assign a precise monetary value to, which left artists with virtually no path to compensation. This wasn't an oversight, it was a loophole that turned a catastrophic loss into a non-event for the balance sheet, while the creators absorbed the full cost. Yet the financial scale of what went up in flames is almost impossible to grasp without context. Forbes reported in 2017 that experts valued the surviving master tapes of legends like the Beatles, Pink Floyd and Bob Dylan at over $100 million per work. The entire UMG archive before the fire was estimated to be worth roughly $5 billion, making it one of the most valuable collections of recorded sound on the planet. How does a company lose a fortune of that magnitude and simply write it off without a single claim being filed? The answer lies in the uncomfortable fact that you cannot insure what you refuse to put a price on. This is exactly why the silence dragged on for over a decade, and it was only broken when artists who should have been notified immediately started asking hard questions. According to The Guardian in 2019, musicians like Randy Newman and Neil Diamond were forced to file lawsuits against UMG, alleging the company had deliberately concealed the true extent of the damage. Their legal actions claimed breach of contract and a direct assault on the value of their copyrights, arguing that the label's secretiveness had destroyed any chance of a fair resolution. When the smoke finally cleared, the real damage was revealed to be a systemic failure of accountability, not just a physical one. If a body of work worth billions isn't protected or even properly appraised, does the industry actually value its artists, or merely exploit them until the ink dries? The answer to that question should haunt every musician who has ever handed over their life's work for safekeeping. When the final tally of lost art is counted, the only thing that seems to have been truly uninsurable was the trust between a creator and their label. Here is the script segment. But out of those ashes, something actually started to change. The National Institute of Standards and Technology now pushes a simple rule called 3-2-1. Keep 3 copies of your tapes, store them on 2 different types of media, and put 1 copy somewhere geographically separate. And yet before 2008, most major labels held just a single master, a single point of failure sitting in a single warehouse. So who is fighting this battle now? A non-profit called the Audio Preservation Fund emerged in 2021, buying cooling equipment and gas-based fire suppression systems for independent label archives. It is a quiet, underfunded effort, but it's proof that the community refuses to let another century of sound vanish without a fight. The statistics, however, are still deeply unsettling. A 2010 Stanford study surveyed over 300 preservation professionals and found that 42% had permanently lost data to physical damage, with 8% of those cases caused specifically by fire. Ask yourself this: how many of your own memories are sitting on a format you can no longer even play? Here is the real kicker. By 2023, only about 5% of Universal Music Group's archive had been fully digitized and moved to secure servers, according to Music Business Worldwide. That means the largest record company on Earth still has roughly 95% of its history exposed to the exact same disaster that already burned it once. Still, there is a small story that offers genuine hope. In 2019, a Reddit user named Taparob described a fire at the tiny Brooklyn studio where he worked. The landlord had rigged the space illegally, and the flames took most of the gear, but not a single recording was lost. Why? Because the studio owner had a habit of backing everything up to a portable drive and taking it home every single night. That one mundane ritual saved over 20 artists' entire bodies of work, and it cost nothing but discipline. So if a scrappy studio in New York can protect itself with a $200 hard drive and a nightly routine, what exactly is the excuse for everyone else? The tools exist, the standards have been written, the proof that fires will come is written in history. And the only thing standing between the next blown fuse and the permanent end of a cultural treasure is a decision someone has to make long before the smoke starts rising. We tend to imagine fire as the only true enemy of the archive, a sudden violent erasure. But there is a quieter, more insidious force at work, one that does its damage without a single flame. This is the slow, relentless decay that comes from within the tape itself, a chemical betrayal that makes the great vault fires look almost merciful. Consider the reels that survive the flames and the water, the ones tucked away in climate-controlled rooms, safe from catastrophe. Even then, they are dying. In 2021, the US National Archives and Records Administration issued a stark warning. A full 33% of their historical audio recordings are degrading so rapidly due to sticky shed syndrome that they are becoming unplayable. This isn't a dramatic conflagration. It's a simple chemical reaction where the binder holding the magnetic particles onto the plastic film absorbs moisture from the air, turning the tape into a gooey, unreadable mess. Ironically, the very systems designed to protect these collections from their most obvious threat might be contributing to their quiet undoing. The main cause of fires in these vaults isn't often the tapes themselves, but overloaded electrical systems. To safeguard the water-sensitive magnetic oxide, automated sprinkler systems are routinely disabled, creating a massive vulnerability. The protection against one disaster opens the door for another, leaving the archive both wet and dry, perfectly primed for either fire or decay. And this is where the loss cuts deeper than any film archive fire. A lost film can sometimes be resurrected from distribution prints scattered across the globe, as the famous 1937 Fox Vault fire showed. But a Music Master tape has no such safety net. There is no equivalent copy waiting in a theatre. The only alternatives are informal mixes, not the definitive originals, making their destruction a far more absolute and permanent cultural erasure. In 1968, a fire tore through a Motown Records warehouse in Detroit, destroying master tapes prized for that signature Philly sound. Luckily, safety copies stored in a separate facility allowed many of those hits to be reissued, but the pattern was already set. Go back further, to 1937, and the archive fire at 20th Century Fox in Little Ferry, New Jersey, wiped out roughly 90% of the studio's silent and early sound films. That single blaze erased an enormous chunk of cinema history, and the loss remains one of the greatest cultural tragedies in the medium's timeline. Even in the modern era, a 2016 fire at a working recording studio in Los Angeles scorched around 2,000 reels of tape from lesser-known bands. That one only caused partial damage because the owners had installed a water mist system normally reserved for server rooms, an expensive safeguard that actually worked. According to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, warehouse fires account for 12% of all major loss fires in the United States between 2010 and 2019. So this is not a rare accident or a freak occurrence. It is a constant repeating hazard across the entire storage industry. Every one of these incidents shares the same underlying flaw. The industry treats original recordings as if they are disposable inventory rather than irreplaceable cultural assets. Why does the lesson never seem to stick? And why do we keep watching the same destruction happen again and again? 118,000 master recordings reduced to ash, and almost nobody said a word for over a decade. We have walked through the smoke of Universal, the silent decay of sticky shed syndrome, and the quiet greed of an industry that valued its vaults less than its quarterly reports. The threats have never been a secret. Fire that melts plastic into a single useless block, humidity that turns history into glue, and the brutal math of digitization costs that studios simply refuse to pay. Today, less than 5% of the world's largest catalogue has been safely backed up, which means we are sitting on a time bomb with a fuse made of aging tape stock and outdated business models. So that original question, why did a disaster of this magnitude vanish from public memory, answers itself, because facing it would force someone to admit that our cultural heritage is not priceless, it is merely uninsured. Do not wait for the next spark. Do not assume your memories are safe in a metal shed on a backlot. Check your old reels, your parents' recordings, your band's master tapes, and digitize them today, because the only thing more fragile than magnetic tape is the silence that follows its loss.